Good afternoon. My name is Margaret Johnson, and I'm the Associate Dean for Experiential Education at the University of Baltimore School of Law, as well as the co-director of the Center on Applied Feminism and the director of the Bronfein Family Law Clinic. I am thrilled to welcome you to this discussion of my colleague and friend, Professor Kim Wehle's third book, How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, a common sense guide to everyday dilemmas. Like her first two books about the Constitution and the importance of voting, this book adds to the layperson's understanding of how to navigate within a complex system of laws and regulations, but in this case, to achieve personal goals rather than societal objectives. Professor Wehle joined the UBalt Law faculty in 2009. She teaches administrative law, civil procedure, and federal courts. She's been an assistant U.S. attorney and served as associate independent counsel in the Whitewater investigation, working under Kenneth Starr. And you may have seen her on CNN, CBSN, and C-SPAN, where she shares her legal expertise, or maybe you've read one of her articles in 4 different magazines, including Politico and The Atlantic, where she's a regular columnist. She also hosts a podcast series, Simple Politics with Kim Wehle. And I'm pleased to welcome an incredible panel of lawyers who know Kim and her work quite well. Glenn Kirschner is a former federal prosecutor with 30 years of trial experience. He served in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia for 24 years, rising to the position of Chief of the Homicide Section. In that capacity, Glenn supervised 30 homicide prosecutors and oversaw all homicide grand jury investigations and prosecutions in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, Glenn served more than 6 years on active duty as an Army Judge Advocate General, a JAG prosecutor, trying court-martial cases and handling criminal appeals, including espionage and death penalty cases. Currently, Kirschner is a legal analyst on MSNBC and NBC, and since 2020, he has hosted an Apple podcast, Justice Matters, with Glenn Kirschner. Michelle Gilman is a Venable Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Faculty Research and Development, Director of the Saul Ewing Civil Advocacy Clinic, and co-director of the Center on Applied Feminism. She teaches privacy law, civil advocacy, evidence, administrative law, and feminist legal theory. Her scholarship focuses on issues relating to poverty, privacy, economic inequality, and feminist legal theory. Beatrice Thomas is an associate in the business litigation group at Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston, LLP. She represents employers in matters involving discrimination before the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and in unemployment hearings and matters involving wrongful termination. She also has experience defending patent claims. Prior to joining Whiteford, she completed a clerkship with the Honorable Michael W. Reed of the Court of Special Appeals of Maryland. Her experience also includes internships with the Honorable Shirley M. Watts of the Court of Appeals of Maryland and the United States Sentencing Commission. Thomas is a 2019 magna cum laude graduate of UBalt Law School, where she served as an editor on the Law Review. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that we will have another faculty book talk this month with Professor John Bessler discussing his new book, Private Prosecution in America, Its Origins, History, and Unconstitutionality in the 21st Century. That webinar will be offered on Thursday, March 31st, and you can learn more about it in the chat. And now let's begin today's discussion. We look forward to your questions and comments, which we invite you to share using the Q&A feature on your Zoom dashboard. We will get to as many as we can. But first, Kim, congratulations on this book. So excited that we're having this panel this evening. I'd love for you to tell our audience about your book and your motivation for writing it.
Well, thank you, Margaret and Glenn and Michelle and Beatrice, and of course, Chris Stutz, who puts all these things together behind the scenes and has been tremendously supportive with my sort of work out in terms of public education. So it's a real honor to be here, particularly such good friends. Why I wrote the book is because a few years ago, and you mentioned my series of 3, I was reading the New York Times, and there was a statement in this definitive newspaper that the president's pardon power is absolute. And I said, that's an overstatement. Lawyers understand that most things are not absolute. There are ways that the president could violate another part of the Constitution. And I wrote my first op-ed that appeared in the Baltimore Sun. And then this sort of passion for public civics education went sort of snowballed step by step, more op-eds and columns, and then radio, and then television, etc. This last book really is a reaction or how to what we've heard about, day in and day out, we're experiencing is the polarized nature of our society, of our politics, and how we engage with each other. And the I think myth to a large degree that lawyers are really about out to win, that they're aggressive, that they're not to be trusted, that they play tricks, that they nitpick little things, and they're actually not about consensus and not about sort of getting to a point where people can agree. And it dawned on me that it's actually the opposite of what we do. What we do in law school, and my students, and I want to thank, by the way, I can see many students that are here and friends that are here. Thank you for being here. My students know, and I know my colleagues on the panel and at UB do this, teaching law and being lawyers, it's about looking for questions. It's about sniffing out the gray areas, the hard stuff, the squishy stuff, the parts where there are two arguments on both sides. It's identifying the potholes in the path forward and figuring out how to maneuver around them. And that might be a settlement. That might be telling your client hard news that, listen, we can't get you what you want. But what we see on TV, when we come into law school, are lawyers, and Glenn isn't beyond expert on this, lawyers arguing for their position before a jury or before a judge. But as Glenn and others on this, Michelle and Margaret, all of us are practicing lawyers, can say, listen, that doesn't demonstrate or reflect the spade work, the weeks, the months of spade work that went up to that point, looking at all of the evidence, going down every rabbit hole, and then figuring out which evidence is verifiable that can be authenticated, because judges and juries, they can't just do whatever they want. They don't act on instinct. There are rules. And we've set up a system of laws with the idea is when people make big decisions, like in the criminal context, about whether someone goes to jail, for example, their liberty, that better be based on good facts. And we are now in a post-factual world where, when I was a kid, in order to do a book report, you had to start at an encyclopedia and maybe get your mom to drop you off at the library, figure out how to use the card catalog, and then go to microfiche. It was really hard to get the information. Now we're seeing what's happening in Ukraine. Our friend Vladimir Putin, who distorted the information that Americans had in 2016 at the ballot box, continues to do it. We are fed garbage into our phones, and that's a big problem. And you know what? Lawyers and investigators, criminal context, know how to get around that stuff, know how to find stuff. So the idea here is to take the skills, the elite skills, frankly, that we learn in law school, that we teach in these elite institutions, and bring some of it to everyday people, because we all have really hard problems in our lives. We all have had those experiences where something huge is dropped on our lap and it feels overwhelming and we don't know where to start. The book attempts to give a methodology to bring some order to the chaos, to take a situation of extreme uncertainty and have a step-by-step path. My students will know, I call it, when I'm teaching classes, I call it a framework, and we learn how to make, Beatrice is nodding, how to make that path. It takes weeks to figure out, to really get how to do it, because it's a skill that we don't have. And I'll just walk through the 5. And I know others have different ways of parsing this, other law professors. Step 1 is break the issue down into smaller ones. Step 2 is identify your values and your aims. I think it surprises people. Lawyers do care about values. We call them policy, but there's a broader social rationale behind our laws. Every law we have, stopping at a stop sign, is because we value not having random negligent accidents. We like safety. So in your life, name that, and name it early, and be very, very specific. Number C, so that's BI. C is collect knowledge. I put knowledge, I chose that word very carefully because we are having this debate about, is there such a thing as a fact? But there is a way to collect information that's verifiable that we rely on. And when it's talking about something like, do you get the elective surgery, or even do you put your child in school during COVID? There are a lot there's information out there, and there's good information out there. And I have some tips in the book on how to become good information sorters, which is a skill we don't have. We need to develop it. We need to teach our children. It needs to be in K through 12. Just like 20, 30 years ago, I learned how to find the information. So that's BIC. Break it down, identify your values, collect lots of knowledge. A is analyze both sides. And, you know, honestly, even in the second and third years in law school, sometimes I have students that are surprised that we have, you know, hypos in class where they have to switch to the other side 5 minutes before they were so sure their position was correct. And I think that's something we're really not great at in our society anymore. We tend to be goal-oriented, team-oriented, position-oriented, and say some stuff to support that. That's a different way of thinking than get curious, get curious, get curious, look at both sides, and then circle back to what our conclusion is. And then T, I think you mentioned this, Margaret, is tolerate the fact that you might be conflicted yourself. You might not get everything you want in that decision. For example, you know, if you decide to send your child to school with a mask, you know, maybe ideologically that'll be hard for you because you believe that, you know, your education of your children shouldn't be constrained by a public school system, for example. That's a trade-off, right? And if you start a big decision, understanding that your values are going to dictate your success, and that you have to, I love all the chats, I must say, I love. And then your values are going to dictate your success. And then also that you can have to accept the fact that you might make people mad at you, or you might kind of be conflicted. Then you can walk away feeling, okay, I can feel good about this, even if you didn't win. We're so into winning. So it's really, Margaret, I was on a pod out in California recently, and the hosts said it felt like the Ted Lasso of lawyers kind of book. That is, you know, if anyone's watched the show Ted Lasso, there's a humanity about him. There's a tolerance for different points of view. There's a non-reactivity about him. He doesn't get defensive. He doesn't get angry. And it's a massive, you know, nationwide hit. People want that. They want that communication and connection. So I wrote the book to try to give people tools, a framework, as I say in my classes, a way to make hard decisions for yourself. Don't listen to me. No offense. Don't listen to Glenn on television. But take the tools, gather the facts. It takes a little extra time, and make the decision for yourself. And that's a way to, Margaret, to feel empowered without doing it through, you're with me or you're against me, you're right, I'm wrong, this team, that team, which can feel empowering, but ultimately I don't think that's a way to make great decisions.
Yeah, so just a few reactions to that. I love how you are really making seen the unseen part of both legal education and lawyering. So bringing a more fulsome view of lawyers and this idea of systematic, strategic, intentional, right? This work that is hard and must be done, and how we can bring it outside of law school to everybody to use in their everyday decision-making. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Beatrice and ask you whether you can give an example of a time when thinking like a lawyer helped you serve your clients or succeed as a lawyer. You've been doing this for a few years now.
Thank you so much for the question, Professor Johnson. I mean, honestly, I must say, when I read this book, I mean, this was just a mirror of what I had been taught in law school by Professor Wehle. And it was so great to see her break it down in this way, because of course, when we're in law school, you know, we're in this like really just intense environment and studying case law, and it's really intense. But I think for me, really breaking things down into smaller pieces, making sure that my client understands, you know, clients come to you with, they have a whole jumble of facts and they think, you know, do I have a case, or is this something that I can get relief for? And really breaking things down for them and helping them see what the law redresses and what the law is like, okay, that may not be something that the law talks about or is redressable by the courts, but being able to break things down is been essential for me when it comes to serving my clients. Because often, that's what they come to me for, to be able to make sense of things that they don't really understand. And so that's been key for me every single day, because I get calls and I get questions all the time. And starting there has always been the first right step.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much. So Glenn, I'm going to turn to you. And can you give an example of how lawyers add value to decision-making?
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things I appreciated about Kim's book is, not only are her books sort of how-to books, right? What you need to know about voting, but they're why-to books and why. How to read the Constitution and why. How to think like a lawyer and why. And, I think the framework that Kim sets out, the BICAT framework, is something that we can bring to everyday decisions that we're all making. Not necessarily where we're going to go to dinner, but how do we approach buying a car? Where are we considering sending our kids to school? We have difficult circumstances of divorce or adoptions, and I think people tend to make decisions based on their gut reaction. And I don't think when you make your decisions based on gut reaction, those decisions are optimal. So if you have a framework like the BICAT framework, it's going to, I think, make you a better decision maker. And what I like is, I think toward the end of the book, she even says, you can think like a lawyer when you're hiring a lawyer, which just feels like just desserts, right? Kind of turning the tables on our own. So, I think what she sets out, giving people a framework for how to think through your decisions in a systematic way, helps us be better decision makers. And one thing that she mentions that's not strictly one of the steps in the BICAT method is, as you're going through this process, pause and think about it and sleep on it. And because I'll tell you, I know that as I'm trying to analyze a problem, if I do it in snap fashion, I'm less likely to reach the optimal decision than if I take some time, I pause, I sleep on it, and I think about it. So, I love what she's done in the book, and I love that it is sort of accessible to everybody. It's written for the layperson, to give folks assistance. Well, I guess what I would leave this topic with is, think like a lawyer, just don't act like a lawyer all the time, because, sometimes lawyers can come across as smarty pants.
Okay, fair enough. So we're going to take the skills and not the attitude, perhaps, forward. So hearing from Beatrice that the breaking it down is really, very important to her. And Glenn, I'm hearing from you this idea of these steps, these systematic steps that provide chances also for reflection, right? To make sure that you're thinking it through, slowing down and not having the gut reaction is something we're gaining from Kim's framework and her BICAT. And I see lots of great chats about Go Framework. Kim, I'm sure you're following the chat to see this. So Michelle, I'm going to turn to you because you are a practicing lawyer with your students in the clinic. And Kim encourages us, right? The T is tolerance, as Kim mentioned. And she encourages us to tolerate that some people will disagree with us, disagree with the decision we make, maybe disagree with that value we have that she talked about in the I for BICAT. And so as a lawyer, what do you do when you're confronted with opponents who maybe are intolerant or who refuse to be flexible and creative thinkers? How do you
That's a good question. And it happens, unfortunately, more than we would like. I am teaching in the clinic, and so my students, as part of their coursework, are representing real clients in cases on behalf of people who couldn't otherwise afford a lawyer. And the stakes are really high in our cases. They involve whether someone will be able to keep or obtain housing, feed their families, get health care. And a lot of the institutions and opponents that are on the other side of us can be really rigid and unforgiving and stuck in their ways, as you mentioned, Margaret. And we don't want to stoop to their level because, as Kim notes in her book, which is so marvelous and demystifying what it is that lawyers do, playing on that battlefield never leads to results that are satisfactory to everyone. So one of the most important things we can do as lawyers is to really think creatively about alternatives and options and the consequences of those different alternatives, and move the opponent to our playing field where it's not just a binary, where there could be infinite number of creative options. And by putting that on the playing field, you force them to engage with those options and to engage with you around them. So we work really hard not to fall into this binary perspective, but to recognize that client goals can be met through a variety of ways. And often there can be overlap between our clients' interests and the opponents, and recognizing that there can be solutions that meet everyone's needs and goals is really, really powerful. Oftentimes, my clinic students are the only ones coming to the table with that framing, but once they present that to the other side, we can see a lot of movement toward a solution that can be satisfactory to everyone. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not win-lose. A lot of cases can be a win-win for everyone involved, but you have to have that mindset going in. And I think Kim's book is really useful at moving towards a win-win mindset, not a zero-sum mindset.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. And so Beatrice, I'm so sorry. I'm going to come back to you. You had the good fortune of having Kim as your professor, as did other students in the chat, which is super cool. So we know where you learned how to come to this idea of the decision-making like a lawyer. I'm wondering if you've used it in a non-professional context in your personal life, whether you were in law school or after law school, and how it helped you. Because that's a big part of Kim's book, is bringing this outside of the law.
Yeah, sure. So definitely, I bought a house in the midst of COVID in 2020. And I mean, buying a house in and of itself is just a really intense process. But really, again, taking things slow. I mean, and throughout the entire process, not just, finding out what you qualify for, but also, what market are you going to be in? Again, that here thinking more like the C, collecting knowledge and getting the right sources, right? The book talks about the sources of where we get information. And Professor Wehle even talked about, back in her day, you had to get this encyclopedia. And now we have everything in the tip of our hands, in our phones. So just making sure that I'm collecting the right information from the right sources. All of that was essential for me to, have a positive process in buying my home. So I would say that was just one of many ways that I've used to thinking like a lawyer outside of the professional setting.
Excellent. And so Glenn, we know that Beatrice learned about this process, this framework by Kat from Kim in law school. I'm wondering, where did you learn how to think like a lawyer? Was it law school? Was it law practice, or both?
I think whatever skills I acquired over the years, I owe most directly to my parents. I had the good fortune of my mom hadn't gone to college, but she was smarter than everybody in the family. My dad was a high school coach. He had gone to college. I kind of jokingly said that I had a nice balanced upbringing because I learned all the do's from my mom and I learned all the don'ts from my dad, and it all kind of balanced out. But I think that's where it started. I mean, they taught me to be, I think, an independent thinker, a critical thinker. They both taught me the importance of empathy. So I think that's where it started. And then I think it came into full focus once I decided to go to law school. And
Oh, no. I think we lost Glenn. Well,
We did
Oh.
lose Glenn, but I'm sure he'll
He'll be
jump
back.
back
while
on.
we wait
Yeah,
for him
yeah.
to join, and I just want to say, Colin Lucy, I see your question in the chat. In the Q&A, excuse me. I encourage other people to write their questions. We will be turning to those in a little bit.
Oh, there he is.
And Glenn, welcome back. You are muted right now. We would love to. You are muted, Glenn.
Mute my there. Okay,
Welcome back.
if there's going to be a problem technologically, it will be my fault. I'm on my iPhone and a call came in and it just kicked me out of Zoom. So I wish I knew how to fix the settings. Anyway, I'm not sure precisely where I dropped out, but I think it came into full focus when I decided to go to law school.
Okay.
And I took my first trial practice class, and I got to actually put a case together, and I got to think about the arguments that I wanted to make about that case. And then I got to stand up on my feet and actually argue my points. And I think for the first time, I felt like, oh, this is kind of fun. It's kind of scary. It's kind of challenging, but it's kind of fun. And so I think I developed it throughout law school. And then I have to tell you, in the 80s, I started out as an Army JAG, and I started as a prosecutor, and I went into the courtroom and I didn't know what in the world I was doing. And I, quite frankly, got my butt handed to me in several trials by far more experienced defense attorneys, so much so that I questioned whether I was really any good at this prosecutorial thing. But, you know, I stuck with it. I learned, I took my lumps. You learn a lot more from your losses than you do your wins. So I had lots of opportunity to learn early on. And I think, you know, and I learned from smarter lawyers and from some of the judges who took me under their wing. And I think, you know, listen, developing these skills, thinking like a lawyer, is, you know, it's a lifelong journey. I'm still doing it, even though I retired after 30 years of being a trial court prosecutor. I never left the courtroom in 30 years. So it's you know, it's something that you will continue to develop through your lifetime. And, you know, and if you're really lucky, you'll also be able to make a living at it and really enjoy what it is you're doing.
Nice. It's nice to think about your parents being the beginning of this project that is you. That's very cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Margaret, let me just jump in on that one, if you
yeah.
don't mind. And I share that with Glenn. My grandparents, I've posted on Instagram. My grandmother's from Ukraine. Sort of like this whole thing is really hitting me hard. Also, 7th grade education. This is the I in BICAT. This is identify your values. You know, identify your values. But not everyone gets that. And in the way that maybe Glenn and I did as kids. But that's a lighthouse in my life. And I tell my own children, don't ever let go of that, even if you have to give up some stuff to adhere to those things. And we're seeing, Glenn and I talk a lot about how, you know, on the national scale, people have lost sight of all of that stuff. So this is really something that I think we can't overemphasize. And the point of the book, in part, the I in BICAT, is to write it down. Write down for yourself, what are your values with respect to that particular issue? And once you've done that, then you'll have a little more guidance going through it. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I was actually going to come to you and I was going to ask you exactly about that in your family. But Kim, I did want to come back to you because I was wondering, you know, it's so awesome to have Beatrice here, who was your law student. You teach many law students, as you have for a long time at our law school, and lucky law students for sure. Can you give an example of a time when this framework, when this BICAT, you really saw it turn on a light bulb for one of the students, and they just transformed in sort of their ability to understand the teachings that you were offering in school?
I'll tell you, it happens every semester. It happens even after class. I think the first time was in 3rd or 4th year of my teaching, where I had a student in civil procedure who got the lowest grade on the midterm and was pretty upset about it. And between the midterm and the final, got the framework concept down, this idea of breaking things down. He ended up with an A+ in that class, and at the top of his class, graduating. Another time that really stands out for me is a student I had who he was pretty salty in class. This kind of, because I encourage these skills every class, and it's new. Like we're learning how to a new skill. And I saw him in another class the next semester. He had enrolled, and he came up to me after class and said, "You're probably surprised that I chose to choose another class with you." And I said, "Yeah, I actually am." He said, "I was a little bit rude." I said, "Well, that's your words, not mine." And he said, "It wasn't until I got to the second semester and I realized how much I learned in your class. And I'm sorry I was like that. I was wrong. But wow, that it just changed everything." And that was honestly one of the most enlightening moments. And the last one was, and I was actually visiting another law school, but I taught a class which students are on here. It was a seminar. I get to teach it at UB in the spring. It was sort of issues in the law. And at that point I was talking about impeachment and Donald Trump on CBS. And so we were covering this stuff. And I asked the students to come to class with each of these topics. We read the Supreme Court cases, all that stuff. But I said, come in with 2 columns with 2 different points of view. Because there's and we talked about how do you sort that? How do you find good sources? And at the end, we did a little round table. There's probably 30 students in the class, and a number of them said, "This is the first time I've come in with questions and not with a preconceived idea on this stuff. And I also felt like I could talk about it and not be pounced on, right? I felt safe talking about this. This is the first time that I've been able to do that." And honestly, Margaret, that's when I was like, we need this book. If our students in our classes in their second and third years are saying, this is the first time I got curious about politically hot legal issues and didn't come in with the side and didn't come in rather to judge people, very Ted Lasso. I wasn't there trying to judge. I was there like, oh gosh, I hadn't thought about it that way because I read the 2 op-eds. I mean, that was honestly, it was one of the highest moments in my teaching when I realized that shift had taken place on a level in their regular interactions with each other. That is, I'm no longer going to judge. I'm not going to prejudge people. I'm going to be curious and thinking like a lawyer, even when it comes to hot topics like abortion or impeachment or whatever it is. That's the piece that, in my dream of dreams would be something that would catch on, outside the sort of the formal law school setting, that people start to go back to their humanity when it comes to making decisions and discussing hard problems. And this goes across the political spectrum rather than isolating and shaming people, because no one wants to get close to you if you've done that. If you're right or you're wrong, if you come out of the box shaming and being defensive, it's over. The communication's over. And ironically, the idea behind the book is lawyers are pretty good in settings like Michelle described at doing that, at breaking through that. That's different from Glenn, trying to put a criminal in jail. That's a totally different story. So,
right. Well, what your comments there, Kim, really make me think about this broader project you've clearly been working on in your public commentary, but also in this series of 3 books that I mentioned at the outstart, which are a book about the Constitution, and as Glenn said, why you should read it and understand it, voting and why, and now thinking like a lawyer. And it really is a project of democracy and building citizenship in a way, as I see it. And you mentioned that, where you thought that this really should be a skill taught in schools. So I wonder if you could talk about this broader project you have and how this fits in.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Margaret, because it's a passion of mine as a mother of 4. I just want these freedoms that are in the Bill of Rights, but the Bill of Rights is enforced through the Constitution. And then if you're not going to adhere or enforce the Constitution, it's just a piece of paper and it goes in the trash. And I don't think people realize that. They think it's just we're Americans and the sun will shine on democracy in the morning. And so I started, as I said, with that insight.
It doesn't happen automatically, Kim. Or
no, it doesn't. Look at what's happening in Ukraine, right? I mean,
right.
That's a burgeoning democracy, but they're literally getting attacked from the outside in. And I was on Glenn's show recently, and I don't know if it's live yet, but we talked about this, that American democracy is getting attacked from the inside out. It's getting attacked by dividing people and instilling hatred through lies. And we're pretty close to it being over. And I know that sounds, people get upset to hear that. Oh, it's hyperbole. It's not. It's not hyperbole. And so book number 1 was, all right, at the time, Brennan Center, no, it wasn't the Brennan Center. It's the Annenberg Center in Philadelphia. Have done studies for many years. 1/3 of Americans can't name the 3 branches. And my law students out there, we all know executive, legislative, judicial at this point, right? But if a third of Americans can't do that, and 10%, it was a 2015 study, 10% of college grads thought Judge Judy's on the Supreme Court. And I got them from Justice Gorsuch's talk about his book a few years ago, that fact, and I did verify it's true. How can we expect to adhere to it if we don't understand? I can't fix my car if it doesn't start in the morning. I need to learn how to do that. And how do we fix our democracy? So that's book number one. And Glenn seized on the and why. And I tell my students, I've seen it in the chat, if you understand the why, you can remember the what, because it makes common sense to you. Then I got finished writing that book. And this sounds like I should know this, but it's like, wait a minute, it all comes down to the ballot box, right? I mean, you've got to have a ticket for speeding or we'll blow through the speed sign. We all do it, unless, right? And lo and behold, there's no affirmative right to vote in the original Constitution. So it doesn't function like the First Amendment. It doesn't function even like the Second Amendment. And so that was the second book leading up to 2020. And then we had the big lie. I was in the middle of writing it, but then we had the big lie where the debate is no longer, I mean, we have all these, hurdles to getting on the ballot, and that's getting worse for sure. And that's due in part to our friends on the Supreme Court with Shelby County in 2013 gutting the critical provision of the Voting Rights Act. But that's still a problem, from ID requirements to, disabled people in Texas having to physically go in and fix their mail-in ballot application because something didn't match with their original sign-up sheet 30 years ago. I mean, it's really obscene. But now it's not even about that. Even if only white males with money, which are the only people that could originally vote, even if they're the only ones who are allowed to vote, we're talking about trashing, throwing out, putting in the garbage votes under this guise of fraud, right? So we're talking about canceling votes, stealing votes. That's entrenched politicians gaming the system to keep power. That's not democracy anymore. That's something more like we're seeing in Russia. I mean, look at Zelensky versus Putin. We're seeing it. Like, these are two visions of government. And so book number 3 was like, maybe we need to go a little bit more deeper than just talking about the systems and try to get people to think more critically about the information that's coming into their brains. And this is also because Congress, we used to have something called the Fairness Doctrine that forced media outlets to give both sides. That died in I think 1986 or sometime in the 1980s. So we are really being manipulated, and we need new tools. And so, like I tell everybody, whoever's watching this, what can I do? First of all, it took me 20 minutes to register by mail in Maryland, but I got the thing. Take the time. We don't have to learn how to use an AR-15 to save our children's democracy like the moms in Ukraine. All we have to do, here it is, fill it out. That's for my daughter. And pass along some of these skills, pass along to one person and ask them to tell one person, put it on your TikTok, put it on your Instagram, have the courage to discuss it at the dinner table in Thanksgiving. And the book will help you. The book maybe will help you not get into a shouting match.
Yeah.
And right. I think if you start with values, your family has very similar values. You can find the common ground and then pivot off of that. Like, do you really trust your politicians or do you trust your best friend? I mean, that's something everybody can agree to. Probably between those, I'll trust my best friend, right? And some of us, not me, but luckily, some of us have lost our best friends in the last few years over this black and white win-lose thinking.
Yeah, so going off of that, I guess you've spoken to this a little bit, Kim, but I want to broaden the conversation, and I'll go to you, Glenn. What are the forces out there that stand in the way of people being able to execute the BICAT or being able to think like a lawyer?
I think a big part of it is the C part of the BICAT approach, which is collecting knowledge, because, I read Kim's book and it actually made me nostalgic for things like the Encyclopedia Britannica and card catalogs and the Dewey Decimal System. I wonder if students even know what the Dewey Decimal System is. But it used to be when we had to collect knowledge, we knew where to go. It was going to be reliable, even if not entirely up to date. And we didn't sort of have this tidal wave of disinformation and propaganda washing over us every day. So, I mean, I think that is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the BICAT approach, but I just want to circle back to what Kim was saying and how she was saying it, because, kind of she's one of these, free agent democracy fighters. She is out there spreading the word about the importance of democracy, the importance of voting, and the tools you need to be a critical thinker, thinking like a lawyer. And what, the last two elements of BICAT, I think, are hugely consequential for all of us today. Argue both sides and tolerate that others will disagree with you, and you might even feel conflicted. How, let's take, the hottest button topic that we're all dealing with, the attack on our US Capitol, which was the attack on our democracy. We can sit here and say, oh, no, this is black and white. There's us and there's them. There's the right-thinking people who love democracy and the people who attack the Capitol. I don't think that's a helpful way to look at it or analyze it or approach this enormous problem we're contending with. Try to think about the other side. There are people out there who choose to listen to news outlets that the former president every day got on and said, your vote was stolen, your vote was stolen, your vote was stolen, your vote was stolen, your president was stolen. And if you don't fight like, quote, hell, you won't have a country anymore. So get down there and stop that steal. Guess what? Americans have every right to listen to their president and act on what he is telling them to do. And I'm not being unkind to say not everybody is a critical thinker. Not everybody seeks out multiple news sources to try to balance the information that's coming in. So I think it's unhelpful for us, the people who disagree with the folks who decided to attack the Capitol, to just say we're right, they're wrong, it's us and them. You have to think about what motivates the other side. Why are they doing what they're doing? And then how can we address it? How can we remedy it? How can we make inroads so that we're more kind of us, not us and them? I've always said it's all us in America, just different kinds of us. To me, there are no thems. There are people who make different decisions for lots of different reasons, including, in my opinion, that they're not thinking critically enough or taking in enough reliable and divergent information. So I think the argue both sides and the tolerate and understand those who disagree with you pieces of BICAT can help move us in a better direction.
Yeah, nice. So I hear a little bit in that last bit, maybe, yes, the critical thinking, yes, the broadening the information, but maybe even some empathy you're talking about in the tolerating, which is really interesting. And I think a part of what you're talking about, Kim, for sure. So I'm going to ask the radical question, and I'll let anyone on the panel answer this. But, this all sounds great to me. We should all think like lawyers. And Kim's book gives us a roadmap to doing that. But are there times when we should not think like a lawyer?
Well, I do talk about it in the book. I'm not a social science researcher, but one time when I was driving up to Baltimore from outside of Washington, where I live, and it's about an hour, and I was on I-95, and I was in the middle lane, and a car stopped in front of me. Like, it stopped. It was 65 miles an hour. It stopped. And in literally a nanosecond, in hindsight, I remember my brain went through this analysis and said, I'm gonna have to merge either way. I don't have time to look over my shoulder. I'm more comfortable and used to merging to the right, so I'm gonna merge to the right. And I did, and I survived, and I burst into tears because of the adrenaline. But there certainly are moments where our amygdala, the ability to their fight or flight response that developed over millennia to keep us safe, is helpful. And you get flooded with hormones, and they're there for a reason. And that's why people want to make a sale in 20 minutes. They don't want you walking around and going through the market and coming back in an hour, because you'll realize I shouldn't have made that decision. But that being said, when it comes to danger, that serves us. So it's certainly not break it down all the time, right? There are things that grind to a halt. And in law school, we talk a lot in civil procedure in particular. I ask the students to think about every rule from the policy standpoint: efficiency, fairness, accuracy. That's just the three that I pick. And if you're going to have a rule that makes lawsuits more efficient, you might compromise on accuracy, or you might compromise on fairness. And that, to Glenn's point, that gets to the T, that gets to the tolerate the fact that you can't have it all. But there are times for quick decision making. And I think identifying for ourselves that there's another way when it's a big problem, and let's try that, is helpful, but we don't necessarily know that, right? So you might be in a situation with a friend or a spouse or a family member or a colleague, and you get triggered and you go into fight or flight and things escalate, or you send the email and you're like, the next morning you're like, oh, I shouldn't have sent the email, right? But sometimes you do need to do that. So that would be my uninformed, again, I'm not a scientist, but my uninformed approach to that. This book is really for the bigger problems. And as we've all been talking about, there are plenty of them internationally, and there are plenty of them, unfortunately, in our personal lives. And I think giving people a system, and Michelle and I were talking about this offline, but giving people a methodology, that's power empowering. If people say knowledge is power, but tools are power as well. How did the human species evolve? Well, we figured out how to use fire, and we figured out wheels, and we figured out writing, and we figured out all of these things. And I think in this moment, we need to figure out how to get through the garbage information and sort good stuff, and how to figure out how to go back to our value system.
Right.
For some reason, Margaret, the Ukrainians have figured this out. I'm very proud to be Ukrainian, because look at how their population has reacted to a massive crisis. We had COVID, and we had we had January 6th, and we became more divided, more hatred. The number one problem with national security in this moment is domestic terrorism. It's not international terrorism. It's not Al-Qaeda. It's domestic terrorism. It's what we talked about on January 6th just now. That's the number one problem. The Ukrainians are all coming together, and they're outmaneuvering, at least for now, the biggest tyrant of the 21st century. So I think we could do it. I think it's in us. We're in the dark. We're in the forest. We need a light. We need a torch. We need a light at the end of the tunnel. We need some guidance, because it's getting kind of ugly in the forest. So that's my answer to that. But I'm interested in hearing what Michelle thinks about that, because I think she proposed the question.
Yeah, and I saw she was taking off her mute button.
One thing I'll add is, so in the clinic, as I mentioned, students have real cases, and we are teaching them how to think like a lawyer and how to help their clients make good decisions. So there's two layers to it when you're practicing lawyer. You're using a framework to make good decisions, and you're using that with your client to help them make good decisions. So it's operating at two layers. And at the end of the semester, we often ask our students, what's the most important thing you learned practicing for the first time as a real lawyer? And a lot of times, obviously, it's the power of representing another human being. It's very profound, and the relationships with their clients. But students also remark on, wow, I didn't really know that lawyers have a methodology like BICAT for making decisions, that we are not operating on experience and instinct, which is, I think, what a lot of the public thinks, and Hollywood hasn't helped in that regard on TV shows. Lawyers make decisions like kind of just off their gut, just by being, I don't know, smart. That's not how it works. That's the point Kim is making in this book, and why it can be so helpful is it's a methodology. It's a system. It's intentional. We pause, as Glenn said, to, take stock of where we are in the decision-making process. And that's a really, really powerful lesson for students in law school. I almost think they just think they're coming in and they're going to learn how to read cases, or they're going to learn a body of knowledge. Well, anyone can open a book and memorize it. Being a lawyer is so much more than just a knowledge transfer of doctrine, right? It's about how to make decisions. So I've been practicing in Maryland my whole career, but I could move to another state with completely different laws than Maryland and still be effective, because I have a methodology. It's not the doctrine. It's really the methodology that makes us so effective and powerful as attorneys.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I want to turn to our questions from the audience. And first, I want to go to Colin Losey, who's been very patient and has provided us two excellent questions. So first, Colin asks, because all lawyers begin their legal education with civil procedure, do we end up with too much of a, quote, litigation is the only way I can solve problems, unquote, mindset? And if so, is the time right for law schools to rethink the curriculum? Kim.
Well, it takes a village and we all teach in different ways. And I do think, I'm not sure where Colin is in sort of legal education. I do think there is too much emphasis on dispute resolution in the core curriculum. And when I say that, it's reading cases where people had fights. What I think shocks a lot of people is, even on the Supreme Court now, they're so polarized, but any 5-4 decision means we had good arguments on both sides. That's the A in BICAT. But I do think there should be more taught on statutory interpretation, reading language really carefully, take a word. First year, everybody's had me in first year, the word showing in Rule 8, we spend weeks and weeks looking at Beatrice on showing. But it gets that idea of craving ambiguity, looking for both sides, and then pulling out the policy arguments. That's what I do in civil procedure. It's not like fight litigation, but I agree with Colin that lawyers tend to be just a little slow in terms of developing and keeping up with kind of just how the world changes. I think, right? I think, and that's part of the problem with the law as well. Part of why we're having issues like January 6th is that we don't have laws necessarily that kept up with that. The problem with the digital age is, the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment, and a lot of our laws don't know what to do when an algorithm feeds you information, or when someone can take your clicks and your swipes and apply an algorithm and then create a full dossier of where you were and what you're thinking and who your friends are and what you're doing. If government just put a wire on you, that would be a Fourth Amendment violation if they didn't follow the proper procedure and comply with the Fourth Amendment and all the statutory requirements, et cetera. So I do think we need to upgrade it. And I do think also we need to take a moderate point of view. This is my personal opinion around some of these issues of social justice. I know there's some, even January 6th, I couldn't agree more with Glenn. What happened on January 6th is real for people. Their people are suffering. And, their people are suffering across the political spectrum in America. And to just so alienate them, that to me is not a path forward for my kids and for a functioning democracy. So empathy means, in my mind, or whatever the word is, it means slowing it down and listening and suspending judgment and not shutting the conversation down because you don't already agree with me. And I'm not suggesting that's what people in the chat are doing. I do it as well. But I think we have to start modeling that. And we part of the problem is that the stakes are really high right now and people are anxious. And so we get in that reactive mode. So this is not an easy task, but it shocked me when I first thought out to buy this book. There is not, a mainstream, I should say. There might be some out there on Amazon commercial book about, chicken soup for the soul using legal analysis, or a how-to using legal analysis. Law schools, people are still applying that. It's really hard to finish. Bar is really difficult. It's very expensive. So I think people can be helped by that because it's not out there yet for the masses. And I hope it, more than just us read it.
Yeah. And I'm actually not going to ask Colin's second question because I think it's a very law school or lawyer approach to or view of what Kim's already talked about, talking about how people are taking quotes out of context from Westlaw and Lexis rather than doing a broader research into what the law is. So I think your point's well taken, Colin, and I think it's been addressed. So I'm going to take moderator's privilege, seeing no other questions. We have 6 minutes left. I'd like to start with you, Beatrice, and sort of go around on my Zoom screen, ending with Kim for just brief final remarks about this book, where we are today, and the power of thinking like a lawyer, and why.
Sure. For me, again, this was like a trip down memory lane of being in Professor Wehle's civil procedure class. And even because I also served as her teaching assistant. And so it really just reiterated things for me that I had already sort of kind of implemented into my practice because I had her as a professor. And I really don't mean to dote on her so much, but that's really what it is. I am grateful for the opportunity to have had a professor who really, from the beginning, first day of my first semester of law school, really had me thinking like, let's break this down. And so I would encourage everyone to buy this book, because again, it's not just for lawyers. Anyone can pick up this book and understand it, and to be able and be able to apply the BICAT method to their life. And so I am grateful for having read it, and definitely have already shared it with others. And so I definitely think it's a game changer with respect to the legal industry and how lawyers and non-lawyers alike think critically to solve everyday issues.
Excellent. Michelle, I'll go to you next.
Thank you. Well, I didn't mention one of my claims to fame here is that I went to law school with Kim Wehle. We go way back as law students, learning to think like lawyers together. And I just mentioned that for all the UB students who are on the event tonight. These are lifelong relationships that you will have, and you will learn and grow as attorneys together. And they are very, very important connections and relationships to maintain as you move through your careers. What I, really find most powerful about Kim's book is it's really a reminder that at the end of the day, lawyers are problem solvers. That's what we do. That's why we are hired. This is a helping profession. It's not a litigation profession. It's a helping profession. It's designed to help make society stronger and to help make individual lives better. And what is really profound about the book is that she takes this knowledge about the lawyering profession and says, we're not a monopoly. We're not going to hog it for ourselves. You can have some of these tools too, right? And that sort of empathy and sharing of what can sometimes be hoarded skills by lawyers, I think is really powerful. If lawyers are problem solvers that make the world better, then certainly people using these tools can also make the world better. And that's a really exciting proposition for me.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for that. Glenn, I'll go to you.
No, and I'm going to echo what Michelle said about using skills like this, not only in your own personal decision-making, but to help make society stronger. That, frankly, is the challenge of our time. And that's why I think some of the elements that Kim highlights in the BICAT method, identifying your values, because, a few minutes ago, I may have sounded like an apologist for the people who attacked the Capitol. I'm not. I'm just trying to understand their point of view, what motivated them. I'm a law and order guy, and I think they need to be held accountable for their crimes, but it certainly mitigates what they did. It may reduce their criminal exposure, their punishment, because they were listening to their president. But we all have to identify our values. We have to collect that knowledge, and it has to be reliable, fact-based knowledge. We have to understand both sides. We have to tolerate that people are going to disagree with us and have different values and different opinions. And we have to bring these skills to, our daily lives and our daily discourse, in hopes that one of our values is that we're all looking to make society stronger and better. And if you lead from a place of empathy and decency, I think you can't go wrong, even if you can't ultimately agree with folks who take very different paths. I think, it will still help build a stronger society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And yes, I saw in the chat there was some conversation, so I'm glad you got a chance to respond to that, Glenn. So Kim, we have a minute left. Yeah, maybe a little less, actually. Final thoughts from you.
Well, I just want to thank everyone on the panel. I can't really restate it or state it better than Beatrice, Michelle, and Glenn just did, in with such eloquence and passion. And it's a gift to know all of you. And I also want to tell to the students out there, my students and other students and would-be students, this book would not have been written without all of you. It's all of these years of putting these pieces together in my own mind and crystallizing it and distilling it, and realizing how important this is to bring outside the classroom. So I'm grateful for that. It's such a privilege. It's a privilege to teach, and it's certainly a privilege to have a platform like Glenn and I do to start spreading these. But I want to leave everybody with the challenge, and that is take some time today to change your mind on something as mundane as, tea or coffee. I don't know. We need to get back into some flexibility in terms of our approach to the world. And there's so much that depends on it. American democracy, really, honestly, the legislature is not going to fix it. The Supreme Court is not going to fix it. They're poised to make it worse. Joe Biden, whatever. I mean, we can hope for good presidents, the ones that adhere to the rule of law, but we're on a march to a January 6th that works. So it takes all of us. The only way to get out of the darkness and into the light is to start modeling a different way. And anyway, so that's my point. But I just again want to say thank you to Baltimore, to my colleagues, to Michelle, to everyone.
Okay, here's the book, How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why. Thank you, Kim, for writing it. And thank you all for serving on this panel. And thank you to our audience for being here. We hope to see you March 31st at the next book event for John Bessler's book. Good night.
Good night, everybody.